So the talk this week was on the topic of getting stuck, a theme or an experience that is part and parcel of what it means to live the human condition. Now, the reason I chose this topic was because, as some of you know, I work psychotherapeutically. I work as a psychoanalytical psychotherapist. And what quite frequently brings people to the clinic for therapeutic work is the fact that they are stuck. They're feeling stuck in their lives. Now, the description of that stuckness can vary, obviously, but the essence of it is the same. A feeling of frustration, a feeling of being in conflict, a feeling of not knowing which way to turn or what to do next. I suppose it's quite pleasantly, in some ways, summed up in the idea of getting stuck. But the experience of it can be far more excruciating and uncomfortable and challenging and can have us at our wits' end. And so I thought I'd talk about this, not solely in relation to yoga and our meditation practice, but in terms of all of it, the formal and informal practice. Informal meaning how we engage in life as practitioners. So, of course, we get stuck with the big things. The big things being those aspects of our lived experience which we give a lot of weight to: our careers, our relationships, our romantic relationships, money, these things. And we can find ourselves sometimes in a situation where we don't know how to act regarding these bigger aspects of our lives. But there are also, let's call them, smaller issues where we can find ourselves getting stuck. And the smaller issues I'd refer to things which are more personal, habits, ways of behaving, how we express, things that we might find ourselves not entirely happy about, not pleased with, things that we'd like to do differently or see ourselves doing differently, but we find it difficult to do so. And so we're caught between a version of ourselves which is behaving in a way which we don't like, and an idea of ourselves behaving in a way that we do like. And so we can find ourselves stuck in the situation where we want to behave and act in certain ways, but we just find ourselves not able to. And then, of course, we can talk about how we get stuck in our spiritual practices, our formal practices. And in this sphere, in this context, we talk about yoga, of which meditation is an important part. And we get stuck as practitioners within our practice. So these are the three areas: the big issues, the small issues, and then the spiritual practice issues. But is the stuckness that we're talking about, is it the same in each of these? If we refer to it as being the feeling of frustration, stuckness leads to a feeling of frustration, a feeling of not knowing how to resolve the issue, how to get out of it. Then, in many regards, the stuckness is the same, regardless of whether it's a big situation, a small situation, or related to our formal spiritual practices. When we bring it back to the issues of our lives, where we find ourselves stuck maybe on whether we should change career, should we stay in this job or should we leave this job? Should we stay in this relationship or should we leave this relationship? Should we continue to nurture this relationship or should we not? Should we invest in this thing or spend the money on this thing or should we not? Now, I'm phrasing it and presenting it here in a very black and white manner. But that's the issue. The feeling of stuckness is because it appears black and white, but it's not experienced in such a black and white manner. And in fact, the experience can span a whole spectrum of grays. So despite our best efforts to rationally argue out what's the best course of action, what we should do, how to proceed, we may even get pen to paper and write down the pros and cons. Maybe we do it more than once, maybe we do it twice or 3 times. We may be able to put together a very strong argument on how we should move, what should be our next step. But nonetheless, we don't do it. Because at a certain level, despite our rational arguing of what's the right course of action, we're not convinced. There's an aspect of us which is not convinced. And so instead of acting, we stay where we are. So this lack of decision then leaves us in a space of limbo, where we're not making a decision to change the situation in any way, but we're not actively making a decision to stay in the situation in which we're in. So no decision is being made. And so this situation that we find ourselves in is as a consequence of our not being able to act rationally. And the reason being because there's something at play at a deeper level which prevents us from feeling convinced about any argument that we put together. Now, something similar happens in terms of the smaller issues that we experience. So the smaller issues, if we talk about it in terms of habits, we may have a certain way of behaving that we'd like to change. We found it to be unuseful, debilitating in some ways. Perhaps it gets us into situations which are uncomfortable and awkward. Perhaps it's related to our health and our well-being. So anyway, we want to overcome this habit. But despite our best efforts, we find ourselves falling short, unable to make the change. And this is frustrating and infuriating and leaves us feeling out of sorts or disconnected from ourselves. So this inability then to follow through on our promise to ourselves, well, from now on, I'm going to be like this. This is how I'm going to do things. And we make these promises to ourselves. Or from now on, I'm going to eat such and such a type of food, which is healthy and good for me. I'll stop eating this stuff. So we make this promise to ourselves. Or from now on, I'm not going to do this behavior when I'm around my family. I'm just going to stop that. It gets me into trouble every time. I'm just not going to do it. So we make these promises to ourselves, but then we find ourselves not being able to follow through. And then to counteract that sense of not having been able to follow through, we will recommit with more fervency, with greater enthusiasm. Okay, no, that's it. Now, from now on, you know what? In the next 5 days, I'm going to do it. Or if I don't do it, this is going to happen. Or we put in these conditions. We really get strict with ourselves. But sometimes what happens is we make excuses. Well, it happened, or I do this because of this. If I had more time, then I would do it like this. If I hadn't been so tired, like this. So we have ways of rationalizing our behavior. But in any case, what we're experiencing is a disconnect, a divide between how we imagine ourselves to be and how we are experiencing ourselves. And so we're stuck, once again, in this middle ground. And this leaves us feeling frustrated, not knowing what to do. So this is the common thread then. This idea that we are a certain type of individual. We're a certain type of individual, and that image that we have of ourselves becomes compromised in these situations where the individual that we imagine ourselves to be isn't the individual that we are experiencing ourselves to be. And so there's a fracture between our imagined self and the idea we have of ourselves and how we experience ourselves. And it's extremely uncomfortable. And it can leave us feeling like we're out of control or we don't have control. It can leave us feeling and questioning, who am I? Now, in terms of our spiritual practice, similar things can happen. It could be a case that we are still challenged in committing ourselves to our practice, to setting up a regular meditation routine and engaging with the formal practices in a disciplined manner. And this can go on for some people for weeks, for months, for years, where their intention is clear. I want to engage in these practices. Maybe they've read a book or they've received some teachings. Perhaps they've gone through a whole course of study. Maybe they've even been initiated into a tradition with this desire, this enthusiasm to engage in these practices. But then despite their best efforts, they might map out, well, this is my routine. I'm going to wake up at this time. I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to meditate, and I'm going to do this. And they have the whole thing mapped out very clearly. And sometimes it can be the case that being overambitious prevents them from being able to achieve all that they want. But sometimes that overambition is as a consequence of knowing that they always fall short. So if we put ourselves into the shoes of this individual, they've read a book and then they've had the privilege of attending a course, and then They have all this information that they want to apply, and they have the inspiration from whatever retreat they were part of or whatever course they took part of, and it's all there within them. Then they go home and you say, okay, that's it. I'm going to make these changes. I'm going to do it. Maybe it lasts for a couple of days. Maybe they get a couple of weeks. Who knows? They might get a couple of months. But then it slips. So they pick themselves up and they reapply themselves. And it slips again. And there's this continuous slipping. And then the promises come in. Well, I'm going to do this. Now I'm going to do this. Well, definitely. On this date, I'm going to start and I'm going to do it like this, rigorously. Or the excuses. Well, it's because of this and that, and I couldn't do it because of this and that. So these mechanisms are employed to rationally explain the situation. But once again, the individual finds themselves stuck between how they imagine and want things to be and how things actually are. And this is true too for long time practitioners, people who may be very familiar with the techniques, people who do meditate. They, on a, let's say, practical level, a logistical level, they give time to these formal practices. They know how to use the techniques, they have experience applying them. But where they find stuckness or experience stuckness will be in the practice itself. Maybe they're not progressing in the way that they imagined they would. Maybe what they experience in deeper states of meditation is an experience of mind which is very distracting, turbulent. It's not how they would like it to be. So even for committed, diligent practitioners, there can be a sense of being stuck because the imagined version of who they are in relation to their practice is quite different to what they're actually experiencing. And perhaps after years and years of practice, this becomes more and more obvious and unavoidable. This discord, this disconnect, and then the frustration sets in, doubts sets in. And for some people, it's a case of wondering, should they continue with the practice? What's the point? And there's a disillusionment. But then if they don't continue, after all these years they've committed, what has it been for? And so once again, the individual's stuck. So when we talk about stuckness like this, when we talk about this experience, whether it's in relation to our big life issues, the smaller issues in relation to our personality, how we experience ourselves, or in relation to how we engage in our formal practices, the common thread, as we said, is the idea of who we are in those experiences, the imagined idea of who we are, and the reality of how we experience ourselves and experience ourselves in relation to the circumstances. So, what's the solution? How do we go about resolving this? Now, this question is very natural for a rational thinking mind. There must be a solution to this. But what we've noticed is that throughout all of these situations is a divide between what we rationally argue and define to be the right course of action. I'll do all of this because of X, Y, and Z. Or I can change this habit if I just do this on such and such a date and I'll stick to it. Or I'll apply myself to my meditation. I'll get up at 6 every morning and meditate for an hour. We can rationally outline all of these things. But something gets in the way, which is not rational. Something is stirring at a deeper level. And it upsets our rationalized argument. And so when the question is asked, well, what's the solution? That's very much from the rational point of view. Can we even trust that the answer is something that won't be undermined? Because when we talk about a solution, and if it was offered here, this is the solution. Would that solution be in favor of the imagined version of who you are or the way you actually experience yourself? Would the solution be in favor of you staying in your job or leaving your job? Would the solution be in favor of you being able to make a shift in some behavioral pattern or not? Which side does the solution fall on? And who's to determine that? Who has the authority to determine that? So for there to be a rational solution, we come up against some very serious ethical dilemmas. What is right for you? So oftentimes people are drawn to, as mentioned at the beginning, psychotherapy, because that's a way of engaging with this experience. But people are also drawn to spiritual traditions, to yoga, to meditation, as an attempt to find some kind of way to resolve this issue. And what they're actually trying to do, in many cases, in most cases, is to be able to have an experience of themselves which is fixed, stable, concrete, where they now have an experience of themselves which is not so scattered, not so uncertain, unpredictable. So this is the desire. By engaging with yoga and meditation, then I will have figured myself out. I will be whole, and I'll be this stable, fixed identity, character that I can now feel comfortable with. No more stuckness. But the character is an expression of life. And there's one thing about life is that it's not fixed, it's not stable, and it is extremely uncertain. So how can the character ever become fixed? So this desire to find a more stable version of who we believe ourselves to be, a more fixed, rigid, static sense of who we are. This desire can be the very cause of our becoming stuck. We have such a tight grip on it that we're forcing ourselves into being and fitting into our ideal version of who we are, this image we have conceived of ourselves. And we do so to such an extent that we actually limit ourselves. So, if we think of this stuckness and the feeling of being stuck, to which we have admitted can be extremely uncomfortable, and while it's easy to talk about it here in this kind of theoretical way, the experience of it can be extremely debilitating, upsetting, and uncomfortable. What therapy offers is an opportunity for us. If we look at our experiencing stuckness as a metaphor or a symptom of something which is going on for us, not something that we need to rush into fixing, that we need to make these overambitious promises, or that we need to rationalize away in any way. If we just accept that this stuckness is expressing something, it's trying to articulate something, it's trying to say something. If we accept that, then through the psychoanalytical, psychotherapeutic process, you have the chance to put it into words. And then by putting it into words, you get to hear it. And through that, then, you allow a space for whatever it is that this stuckness is trying to express, whatever truth it's trying to reveal, to become clearer, to begin to make itself known. So basically, you're not out to solve it. By engaging in therapeutic process, you're not out to solve the stuckness. You're out to give it its voice and see what it has to say. Now, the stuckness acts as a symptom in this way. And as practitioners within this tradition, indeed as spiritual practitioners of any tradition, what's going to prevent us from being able to discover where it is that we should move to, how we should maneuver, how to best to navigate this situation. What will prevent us is our clinging to an imagined idea of who we are. Stuckness, once it presents itself in our lives, cannot be rationally explained away. But there's no rational solution to it. Therapy, as mentioned, offers a way to give voice to it. But if we're going to give voice to it, we have to be able to sit with it, to experience it, without trying to push it away, rid ourselves of the experience. So, from our yogic, philosophical point of view, we can talk about this then, that the stuckness is an expression of created reality. It's an experience within the domain of manifested reality. It is Prakriti, an expression within Prakriti. And as Samkhya philosophy guides us, it reminds us that we are the pure conscious awareness which is apart from that. We are the Purusha, the observer, the witness. So, what takes place in Prakriti, we have the capacity to sit with, to observe, to witness. And in doing that, then, we can allow the processes of Prakriti to unfold without clinging to that which establishes and fixes the I so rigidly. So, as a reflection, we can ask ourselves what's going on for us in terms of our own lives. We've talked about big issues, small issues in our spiritual practice. And we can reflect on what's going on for us in our own lives right now in relation to one of these areas where we might be experiencing conflict, frustration, and stuckness. You might be feeling stuck. And what would happen in relation to that situation if we were to just lighten our grip, to soften up our attitude towards this fixed imaginary sense of self that we have? So it's not for us to rush to solve and resolve stuckness, to explain it away, rationalize it, and remove it. As practitioners, what will be most helpful is for us to recognize it as a teacher. It's a teacher which is giving us the chance to know something of a deeper truth within us. So I just offer this talk as an opportunity for reflection.